June 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson, and joining me in the studio today is Patrick Henningsen. Afternoon, Patrick.
Good to be with you, Mike.
And joining us by video link, we've got David Scott from Northern Exposure and Mark Anderson from American Free Press. Welcome to the programme, both of you.
Good morning.
Glad to be here.
Well, yes, it is morning for you, Mark. What time is it?
8 a.m.
Good. Well, that's dedication for you. Let's get straight into the programme because we've got a lot to get through today. And David, Nippy was on the television last night facing off against Boris Johnson. How did that go?
Well, by and large, Nippy looks a bit amateurish when she comes up against proper politicians, even though we might not quite qualify Boris as a proper politician. And she was living up to her name in making nippy comments, and there was very little in way of big ideas or enlightenment or clarity in anything she had to say. And by far the most coherent arguments were put forward, as is usually the case in these debates, by the Leave side, and the bigger arguments and the arguments with some vision for what the country could be. Nicola's main point was that we now seem to be in a position where we have to run both international policy and entire domestic policy, and it would seem economic policy, all for one reason, and that is to protect the NHS. So rather than serving the country, the NHS seems to be the thing that the country must serve.
Yes, well, indeed. But Boris Johnson then was accused of putting personal ambition ahead of national interest.
Really, you don't say, Boris? Well, I'm amazed. What can you say? This is a man who's defined personal ambition. I thought that was a given.
Well, indeed. So, is he going to be Prime Minister by Christmas?
Well, there's an interesting parallel here with Scotland, because the independence referendum here really reset and redefined Scottish politics. And although the Brexit referendum has not caught the public imagination to the same extent, it may yet do that for British politics as a whole. We'll see. I mean, Cameron has already announced his retirement, so he's going to be increasingly viewed as yesterday's man. Who will replace him? There's not that many to choose from. Theresa May, Osborne. I mean, you can see why people are favouring Boris.
Pretty bad choices, but this was a point you've been making, that the Brexit referendum has the potential to redefine British politics.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity for the party to re-establish a new foothold in its crumbling traction. So, front page of the Telegraph, I don't know if we'll have that slide today, but who was the Thatcher's defence minister?
Hogg.
Hogg comes out last night and says that he's withdrawing his membership from the Conservative Party because of the fear-mongering of the Remain campaign led by David Cameron, and that he will only reinstate his Conservative membership if there's a change in leadership. And so he's already hinting that perhaps this is Boris. So you have these old luminaries playing their role like a Shakespeare play, Mike, coming up at the right time, speaking to the right newspaper, and it's absolutely stage managed, as we said in the previous shows.
Well, just before we move on from this subject, just for a short time, David, expand a little bit more on this, because the Scotsman suggesting that the Scots would vote to stay in the UK after a Brexit vote.
Yes, the allegation that a vote to leave the EU and that the Brexit vote would need another independence referendum. Now, that's simply an excuse, but what we're saying here is there's no appetite, even under those circumstances, for breaking up the UK. And for the SNP, it's even more fundamental than that. They have a policy entirely predicated on the EU. We're going to be economics. Independence within Europe is the policy. The economic case is dependent upon a European marketplace and European help in many regards, and upon oil. We'll come to oil later. But if we leave the EU, where does that leave the SNP's pro-independence policies? It leaves them in a shambles. They don't even have a currency to use, because independence would mean joining the EU from outside, which would mean adopting the euro, which is hardly something that's going to be well received in Scotland.
Indeed. Okay, well, let's move on. Bilderberg, of course, has begun. Bilderberg began yesterday, Mark, is that right?
Correct, through the 12th.
Okay, so here is this is actually Charlie Skelton in the Guardian, and overall, Patrick, this was a relatively balanced article from Charlie this year, and really sort of making the point, certainly naming some of the people that are there and making the point, well, if there's barricades and so on, it's hardly a surprise.
Yeah, no, what the good thing about Charlie Skelton's article here is, he has followed these threads from year to year about who's attending, but more importantly, from what industry they're attending. And Charlie's one of the first people that turned me on to the high-tech billionaire class, the Peter Thiels, he called them the Young Turks of Bilderberg back in 2012. And you can see that they've occupied a more important positions in dominating steering committees. Now, Eric Schmidt, Peter Thiel, and some of the artificial intelligence startups that are now multi-billion-dollar capitalized companies.
Well, we'll come on to that. But Mark, what do you make of the attendee list this year?
It is more weighted toward the high-tech crowd, the corporate crowd. Certainly politicians from the U.S., sitting elected politicians and other U.S. officials are becoming fewer, slowly but surely, with the exception being this year Senator Lindsey Graham, the neocon conservative war hawk from South Carolina. And I suppose we'll talk about him in a moment. But yeah, it is weighted, and American Free Press, Jim Tucker and I noted that at about the same time, 2011, 2012, that it was becoming more of a corporate and techie class and less of a political input, at least from the United States, starting at that time.
Yes. Now, Theo, would you mind just seeing if you could increase Mark's volume a little bit, please, because it is a bit low. But Mark, let's just get on to Lindsey Graham, because it was a bit of a surprise, perhaps, that he was on the attendee list when, in fact, he was in the Senate yesterday, voting on increasing military funding.
That's correct. And I need to check today. They're just opening their offices about an hour from now, and to see if he's still voting on the Senate floor. The Senate is in full session today and Monday, as it was yesterday and Wednesday, and he still hadn't left for Bilderberg as of yesterday, 3 o'clock Eastern time in the United States. I've got an airtight source on whether he's there or not today. I'll be finding that out. But even the Kansas City Star, a mainstream paper, broke the usual Bilderberg silence and reported that he's apparently headed to Bilderberg in Dresden. I'm going to be confirming that. And yes, he's voting, he's urging much more military spending. And that, of course, is kind of ridiculous, but we'll leave that alone. But apparently, the Kansas City Star is saying, as I was thinking, that he's going to Bilderberg as some sort of conduit on slowing down or defeating Donald Trump from getting the GOP presidential nomination. Exactly how and how effectively that would be done is anybody's guess, but this is the speculation that that's why he's evidently going to Bilderberg.
Yeah, well, let's just have a look. Here's confirmation from the Kansas City Star that he is going, and in fact, he is listed on the Bilderberg website itself as being an attendee. But let's have a look at some of the other people, and perhaps this gives us a clue as to some of the subject matter that's going to be discussed. So we've got three individuals from the artificial intelligence community, Demis Hassabis, who's a co-founder of DeepMind, Alex Karp from Palantir, Peter Thiel from Thiel Capital, and Patrick, we just thought we'd have a look at DeepMind themselves.
Yeah, so DeepMind falling under Google's umbrella. This is a company that is founded in London. So this is a UK creation, and they work in algorithms. So these are AI algorithms being developed by this company. So they're a major player. So this, to give you an idea, or to give our listeners an idea, this is what goes on behind the scenes of AI. This is an actual AI application that runs out and does the work. So, leading company there.
Yes, and just by coincidence, the Times tweeting out today that yes, killer robots are now a thing, and that points to their article here that RAF drones could strike without human sanction, and they're highlighting the latest RAF drone technology, which is completely autonomous. artificial intelligence driven, and they're also highlighting a French equivalent in this article.
You want to talk about a paradox, AI and drone technology, or drone strikes by AI. That's a paradox because it obliterates the whole legal framework of warfare at that point, because it's not a human making the decision.
Yeah.
So the fact that this isn't being debated at the highest levels already should be very frightening for people, because this would indicate that they're not planning to debate the introduction of AI drones, and that is a very frightening prospect.
Absolutely. Let's move on. Who else is going to be there? There are going to be 4 mayors there. Edward Philippe, who's the mayor of Le Havre, Ahmed Outaleb, mayor of Rotterdam, Kasia Ollongren, the mayor of Amsterdam, and Stanislav Tillich, the mayor of Saxony, and he's a regional mayor. And let's put this in a bit of context as well, because of course we've been highlighting the global parliament of mayors, the whole devolution agenda and what this means for national sovereignty. And as well as that, we have representing cities, Carlo Ratti, who's the director of Sensible City Lab, and that's sense it's spelt S-E-N-S-E, able, sensible, as in again really artificial intelligence here.
Carlo's Italian, but he's a director. I think it's a Massachusetts Institute of Technology-based department or research lab called Sensible City. So this is along the lines of the doing the work for smart cities.
Right. So this is Smart Cities Agenda. This is the Sensible Cities website. Do go and have a look at it. And Resilient Cities, of course, is another aspect of this. And I strongly recommend anybody that's watching this program goes and looks at those 2 articles on the Parliament of Mayors and the Resilient Cities program. But David and Mark, we'll start with David. None of this agenda is being driven by the European Union.
No, none of it is being driven by the European Union. And it seems to be less clear as to what the political drivers actually are. We seem to know some of the names before. We could identify who the main players were. It seems to me, at least, to be much more opaque now as to who's actually running this particular show.
Yes. Mark, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I covered the Chicago Council on Global Affairs Global Cities Forum June 2nd in person. And there's definitely this notion that cities can become an entity unto themselves, be given global standards in infrastructure and cultural artifacts and all sorts of different matters. Not all of it bad necessarily per se, but the notion that a city becomes a global entity due to certain standards that it must meet, and then joins the global neighborhood, kind of a world grid, and sort of bypasses the nation state, in lack of a better description. And this is what the Chicago Council on Global Affairs talked about. I'm taking a little bit different approach for Bilderberg this year for American Free Press. So I'm focusing a lot on this smart cities, global cities thing, and Chicago is a major hub of this.
And of course, as you say, this is about a global grid. It's global governance of a type that we haven't actually seen before, and it's all happening under the radar. While we're all busy looking at the European Union, this is all going on under the radar. Sorry, Theo, see if you can get David back online there, please. But let's just sort of give us one example of something which would disappear if we were to stay, will disappear if we were to stay within the EU. I'm not saying for 1 second we shouldn't get out of the European Union, but this is the UK criminal law blog talking about jury nullification. Now, this is very much a common law thing. It's very much a British common law thing. And although this article says that, is highlighting the fact that jury nullification is something which the Americans understand, one of the points that this law blog makes, written by a lawyer, is that British judges really keep the whole issue of jury nullification quiet. So it has to be said that juries in this country are being absolutely they are coming under pressure politically. We keep seeing anti-jury stories in the press, and this is a pretty dangerous situation. juries will disappear if we stay on long term within the EU. So I'm not saying we should get out, but what I think is really key here is who's driving the agenda. And while we're all watching the EU referendum PSYOP, we're going to come on to what's going on in the background. Now, today, John Mann came out and said he is now for Brexit. But again, something that I want to highlight is that when he was on BBC Radio 4 this morning, on the Today programme, he was basically saying if we return power to the British Parliament, we should go a lot further, from Brussels to Westminster, from Westminster to a local level. And this is the key point. We're talking about removing sovereignty from Parliament and turning ourselves into this global parliament of mayors and similar infrastructure, not only city-states, not only city regions, but regional unitary authorities, all with mayors. What are your thoughts on that?
It does seem to be a bit of a two-edged sword. What's not being talked about is returning power to the individual, because the country was built on the individual retaining power, the individual retaining a great deal of sovereignty, and the individual being very clear as to what his or her rights are. And the state was really only there to operate on behalf of collectivised, voluntarily given over power and rights from the individuals. Now, if that's the starting point, then a local organisation of that would be best to tackle some sorts of problems, and a national one to tackle other problems such as defence. In fact, very little would need to be left to a national government under those circumstances. But if, on the other hand, we are looking at the individual being simply a slave of the state, and the state becomes ever more opaque, it's ever less clear as to what you're actually being ruled by, then the reverse happens and individual liberty gets eroded. And we find ourselves more and more under control and under observation without any rights of our own.
So that is exactly, you've hit the nail on the head there, I think, because what's being sold is your first proposition, and what's actually happening is your second proposition, and that's the danger of it. And again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't come out of the EU. I absolutely am saying we should come out of the EU, but my point here is that none of this agenda is being driven by the EU, and therefore, in or out, it makes no difference. We've got to try to get a handle on the policy agendas that are being pushed through. And what I'm saying here is that the EU referendum in this context is a PSYOP. It's there to divert people's attention away from what else is going on.
And the other thing I'm going to point out, just on the back of what David has just said there, throughout history, I don't think there's ever been an instance, not if anybody can correct me if I'm wrong, where taxation has actually been repealed. So once a tax is in place, that's it, it's permanent. So when you talk about devolution, when you talk about new governmental structures, regional structures, this is only also to add double, triple, quadruple taxation, different layers of taxation. You saw how we have a poll tax in this country, which is the council tax, but that's only the beginning. If you go to a city and regional governance model, you'll have the national tax, you have the EU tax, you have the city tax, you have the regional tax, 4 taxes, 4 regimes of taxation. So what's left for the person who's working for a living, what's left in their pocket? Probably very little.
Nothing. Mark, have you any thoughts on what we've been discussing?
Well, I would kind of continue the conversation on this mayoral and city thing, just to get more of the news out there. When I was in Chicago, Kasim Reed, who attended Bilderberg in 2014 in Denmark, was there. He's the mayor of Atlanta. And then you guys might be familiar with Boris Palmer, the mayor of Tübingen, Germany. He's a Green Party member. And there was also Rahm Emanuel, the Zionist-connected mayor of the city of Chicago, which sees itself as this major global city where NATO met in 2012 for its big summit. And so just to keep extending the line on this global city governance, that's more the specifics of who was there in Chicago. And they seem to be taking a different tack than only using the EU. You know, the Bilderberg group helped create the EU, once the basic foundation was laid through the European coal and steel community way back when in the 50s, late 40s, coming out of Bretton Woods, when the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization were created, all the currencies were linked to each other and all that. And there was also the rather obscure Committee for Economic Development, which is still operating and has called for ending judicial elections in the United States, and has also, if memory serves, come out against juries to some extent. But at any rate, yeah, they're definitely trying a different tack through Bilderberg, through the high-tech AI thing you were talking about, automatic warfare, a very scary Orwellian prospect, and this city-state, this city, global cities kind of system. And I think you said it right, Mike. They're trying to kind of fly things under the radar to keep us looking at the EU, which, you know, the cement has already pretty much dried on the EU. The Bilderberg group has done its part for creating the EU, and they're working along different levels now in this tapestry that they're weaving. So we have to be very watchful that they don't do a sleight of hand like they often do and keep us looking one way while they're doing something the other way.
And as if to reinforce that, today the Institute of Public Policy Research has published this report called City Systems. It's all full of this same language and same rhetoric about cities collaborating with each other and the whole notion of the regional city-states. So if we want to learn more about this, please do have a read of the articles in the One World Governance series on the UK Column website. And there's quite a number of them, as you'll see here. And also have a look at the Common Purpose Effect articles. There's a few in that series as well. These are key articles. As well as that is Patrick Henningson's Smart Power and the Human Rights Industrial Complex article. This is a huge piece of work. And although it's focusing on the NGO complex in the Middle East, perhaps, this applies equally. I mean, Alex Thompson on Wednesday described what's going on in France at the moment as a colour revolution. This is indicative of the type of activities that you're describing in this article. And then finally, before we move on, the NHS Common Purpose towards 1 million change agents. You've got to understand what Martin Edwards is talking about on that, because what we're talking about here is the Common Purpose. And although Common Purpose, the organisation, has been instrumental in driving this forward, the Common Purpose is much bigger, and we've just given a slight hint of it in the last 20 minutes.
Well, the Common Purpose, it seems to be, Mike, to shatter the existing social and organizational structures of society. It's to break it up, to smash it, and then to rebuild something else in its place. And I think we're giving you some hints today on this program of what that new structure, what that new system might look like.
Might look like, yes. Mark, just before we move on, have you got any closing comments on Bilderberg and what else? Have we missed anything for this year?
Well, I think that we need to watch, of course, and confirm that Lindsey Graham actually shows up, since the Senate is so busy. And we've already discussed why he might be there. We talked about the Kansas City Star breaking the usual stony media silence about Bilderberg on the American side of the pond. Naturally, we have to keep watching that they're continuing to push TTIP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and a couple other trade deals I mentioned in an article that's on AmericanFreePress.net right now. People can check out our latest article there to read more about a couple other trade deals. And of course, their world taxation grid, where they're exploiting the Panama Papers and the EU Army and some of these broader things that are always on their agenda, regardless of what official agenda they might announce. This year's agenda that they announce, of course, is particularly laughable. One of the agenda items is simply current events. You know, it's really kind of a mockery of the public when they put out such amusingly simple and generic lists of things that they're going to discuss. You know, you can drive an entire universe through the words current events. And so, you know, they're decidedly and purposely vague. But like usual, it's always very difficult to map out exactly what they're talking about. But I think with the global cities thing, we're really hitting on the key thing, along with the technology and the AI. This is the really sizzly stuff, the stuff that has the sizzle, along with these longer-term projects. So, and of course, we'll watch to see whether there's large protests this weekend or not in Dresden.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Mark. Now, you're welcome to stay if you're able to, but I know you said you might have to drop off. But stay if you can.
There is something I can add about global cities if you're still on that topic.
Okay. Pat, you wanted to...
Oh, quickly, I just wanted to say that, looking at a lot of the coverage of Bilderberg, even in the so-called alternative media, and almost no one mentioning or speaking about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, or Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. It's not even spoken of.
Yeah.
And I find that kind of astonishing, considering that this is probably one of the main lifetime works. This is the craft, if you will, of Bilderberg.
Yeah.
And the Trilateral Commission, and no one's, so the so-called alternative media, I guess, whoever they are, don't believe this is an important aspect of Bilderberg, when I think it's actually the central aspect of all their work, in my opinion.
Final comment, Mark?
Exactly right, and that's reflected on the article at AmericanFreePress.net, as well as some past writings I've done. What I'll mention while I have a good opportunity is I recently discovered that Global Cities Incorporated, a program of Bloomberg Philanthropies. This is Michael Bloomberg, the pro-Zionist former mayor of New York City. This is another driving force behind the Global Cities movement that's being overlooked. We'll talk about it in more detail later, but Global Cities Incorporated, Bloomberg Philanthropies, there's that all-important word that they hide the global agenda under, philanthropy. This is another player in the game. And so we're going to keep them on the radar.
And Bloomberg is well represented on the guest list, I might add. Bloomberg News and all the Bloomberg financial media heads are there at Bilderberg, so Mark's actually spot on there.
Okay, we're going to move on to Scottish issues now. David, Janice and Brian Doherty, you went to meet them, I believe, a weekend or two ago. Tell us what this is about.
Yes, this was last weekend. I spent the whole weekend with them. They're both Scots. They're currently in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, because, reasons which will become apparent to listeners and viewers just in a moment or two. Their story, which is well known to the political leaders in this country, is as Brian Doherty has made a point of trying to enlist political help to overcome the criminality and cover-up that he's encountered. Their story started in August 2014, late July, August 2014. They'd moved to a very rural part of Scotland, and it's located near Fraserburgh and Peterhead in Aberdeenshire. And they were approached. They've got 4 children. And one of whom is autistic, and they were approached by a somewhat creepy neighbour who wished to have sexual access to their autistic son, and offered them £25,000 to do with as you please if he could have access to this boy. And Brian Doherty told him in no uncertain terms where to go, and then reported the issue to the National Crime Agency. After around a week of emailing, they said, just go along and speak to your local Police Scotland. And he did, and he spoke initially to a Sergeant Buchan, and then went in to make a report to 2 other officers who Sergeant Buchan said would be ideal to deal with this matter. So he went in to make the report, and the 2 officers turned out to be very inexperienced and young officers. And within 24 hours, Sergeant Buchan was at the door of the Doherty's house, persuading them that there was nothing amiss. What can I do? He repeatedly said. What can I do to persuade you? There's nothing here. There's nothing to worry about. I've spoken to this man. He's not a paedophile. Everything's fine. So that was within 24 hours. And the Dohertys are saying, no. It's a problem. This man's a risk. This man's a threat. This man's dangerous to children. What happened in the aftermath of that was there was a lot of strange events in the local estate. They tried to warn the nearby landowner, the landowner that they rented the property from, who also had children. And then they were looking at eviction. They were also looking at social services involvement. Social services were very concerned about their interest in paedophiles, and they were very concerned about their children, and one of their children wasn't in education, even though they were homeschooled, and homeschooled with the knowledge and approval of the local authority. Brian Docherty, incidentally, is a teacher. That's what he was doing. He was a high school teacher in the Fraserburgh area. So claiming they weren't in schooling was factually incorrect. So the pressure mounted, and after about a month of this, with social services taking an ever closer interest in the family, they concluded that there was going to be an attempt to seize the children. There were suggestions that they were delusional or imagining this problem. The problem wasn't investigated. There was no investigation. People who are familiar with the Holly Gregg case will understand what the game plan is here. All of a sudden, you start having issues of psychiatric concern raised, and child welfare, and are your children safe because you've reported criminal action? So they decided to spend a week in Ireland and start to write to political people of power, such as Nicola Sturgeon, to seek help. And then the story got much more severe. Now, we've got a detailed interview on this, which we'll be launching in the Dispatches series just shortly. It's 5 hours of audio, some of it quite harrowing, but all of it very accurate and painstaking and heartfelt. And I would encourage people to seek that out and get that information firsthand. So what subsequently happened in Ireland is there was more pressure from Irish social services, culminating in the children being seized by 2 social workers and 4 police officers, 4 Garda officers, 2 of whom were armed. And when this came to court, the conclusion was there was no case to answer, really. There was no allegations against this family, and their children were returned. And the judge was quite scathing and told them that the information had come from Scotland, information which contained allegations that they have yet not seen, they don't know what they're being accused of, was not to follow this family around, and they were to be left alone. But they were not left alone. They were followed. There was constant activity outside whatever house they were staying in. And 10 months later, the children were seized again. This time there was 5 social workers and 8 Garda officers, 4 of whom were armed, and the children were taken by force. Their eldest daughter is 13 by this point, and is quite able to say that she doesn't want to go with the police officers. She was marched down a flight of stairs with her arm up her back by a large Garda officer, and taken by force. And they were held on basically an interim care order, which is meant to last for 8 days. That was 6 months ago, and they haven't seen their children in 5 months.
So they don't even have contact, David. Is that correct?
They don't have contact anymore. The youngest son had some bruising. There was three instances of bruising when he was in care, and in the third case, Brian Docherty took a photograph of the bruising on his 18-month-old son. And as soon as he took a photograph, the social worker said, "We're very concerned about how your mental health is presenting here," and have not been allowed to see the children since. Incidentally, on the mental health issue, they did take the step of finding independent psychiatrists and having a full assessment done of their own mental health, and the report on that was stellar. There was no problem there at all. So it's a family that have no criminal record. I mean, they're teachers and school teachers with actually very high profile, very sort of stellar teaching career. No history of any sort of criminal wrongdoing. No allegations against them. No allegations of child neglect. In fact, the person appointed by the Irish state to protect the interests of the child has written to them say that your children are a credit to you. They're loving and kind and care for one another, and they're very They're great kids. So there's not even a suggestion that they're bad parents. The only suggestion is that they reported a paedophile in Aberdeen, and then the world fell in upon them. The world in the form of 3 states, because there's been pressure here applied by Police Scotland and Social Services Scotland, the Police Service of Northern Ireland, and the Garda and Irish Social Services.
The parallels here to Holly Gregg are immense. Look, you said this is going to be released next week, I presume, as it dispatches from the front.
Yes, it should be out within a few days. It'll be several episodes because it's 5 hours of audio in all that tells the story in detail and in full.
And is there anything that people can do to help? Can people contact you? Contact them through you, and at least offer support?
They can, and they can contact them through the column. They can also, I list at the end of this audio people that can be usefully written to encourage them to help this family. That would include Nicola Sturgeon and Enda Kenny, the respective heads of 2 of the states involved. And it would also include, we've got emails and things in the audio series that list the people that should be contacted. So when we put that up live, we'll make sure there's a full list of names and email addresses. Because what we need here is people to get involved and start asking questions. Why are these people being denied access to their family? Why have they not seen their kids in 5 months? Why are the children seized? What interest do Irish or indeed Scottish social services have in this family in any event? Why are they being denied legal aid? They put on their own initiative, put together a habeas corpus writ for the High Court in Dublin. The High Court refused to accept the habeas corpus writ. Why? There are many, many questions to ask.
Just finally on this for today, David, if we could, do they know what this condition of their children is, where they're being held, and do they actually have answers to these questions, or have they just disappeared into a black hole?
They don't know in detail. No, they haven't seen them in 5 months. They have a certain amount of email communication with the guardian appointed by the Irish state, who says the children are well, but they don't get to see them, which is a tricky thing. Yes. I would just point out before we leave this one, there's one question that's not really suitable for the government or the wise overlords. There doesn't seem to be any genuine complaint or threat or allegation against this family at all, and they've been hounded in 3 countries because they reported a paedophile. Who has the power to do that, Mike? It must be a short list. There can't be many people on that list. And they're almost revealing themselves. They're close to revealing themselves.
Yes.
Simply by the nature of the action that they've taken here, because that's a short list.
Absolutely. Any thoughts?
No, other than I think definitely David's right. Something scraped very close to something very big.
Yes.
Behind the scenes. So.
Okay. Well, look, David, it's nearly 1:45, so we're really short for time. So let's move through some of these reasonably quickly if we can. Named person scheme. The backlash against this seems to be building quite nicely.
Yes, there was a parliamentary debate which was a bit of a train wreck. I mean, the amount of anger and lies that comes out of the government side and other opposition parties. The Conservatives are opposed to this, but the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats, the Green Party, are all kind of supporting named person. But the press, the public, the people view it correctly for what it is. And these 2 articles here, one is written by a person who's been made a named person.
Yes, so the headline is, "As a named person, I know this law is both rotten and dangerous." I mean, you can't really make a stronger comment than that if you are actually one of the chosen named persons.
Well, this is it. I'll just quote the final paragraph from that. He says, "It is part of a corrosive suspicion of ordinary people led by politicians who desperately want their votes but don't trust them to bring up their own children. It would be farcical if it wasn't so sad. That is spot on. People are seeing through this. And the campaign is not going to go away, irrespective of what the courts say, irrespective of what the politicians say. The people will not accept this.
Yes. Okay. Look, let's move on to sort of financial matters here. Is the slump in the oil price going to cost 120,000 jobs in Scotland?
Well, this is the figure that's come up with. As for the UK as a whole, it's unlikely to be Scotland, just that sort of number. But it is having a very major effect in Aberdeen. We're seeing lots of rounds of redundancies. We're seeing, you know that the oil industry is not doing much if you drive up the east coast of Scotland, because you see the rigs and the supply vessels all tied up next to the shore. And when things are busy, you don't see anything because they're all out far to sea. So there are certainly jobs being lost, and of course the case for Scottish independence, the financial case, such as it was ever made, it was always very woolly, and it was always essentially ignoring the facts of economic life. But such as it was predicated, at least in terms of government finance, on a large slice of money coming in from the oil industry, and that's just not there. That will affect us all in the UK, not just Scotland, but it has particular importance for Scotland.
Yes. Now, we mentioned this story yesterday briefly and said that we'd ask you for comment on it today. Well, you have actually wanted to speak about this today. So Japan's bond market, I think the bank we mentioned yesterday was Mitsubishi, ducking out of the bond market, or at least suggesting that they're going to. So what is going on here?
Well, this would suggest that the Japanese JGB bond market, which is the second largest after America, the second largest government bond market in the world, may well be close to collapse. Now, one of the commentators on this, I would encourage people to seek out, is a chap called Kyle Bass, who's a hedge fund manager. And some years ago, he was perhaps 2 years early. Some years ago, he was saying, well, Japan, economically speaking, is a bug looking for a windshield. This is going to collapse. The Japanese government are going to basically implode the bond market and their currency. And there's no way out for them, because they've reached the end of the road. They've had 30 years of stagnation. With stimulus after stimulus, building bigger and bigger piles of debt, and there's nowhere left to go. And they've reached a point with an aging population where people are going to be dis-saving. They're going to be cashing in their savings in order to live on in their retirement. And there's nobody left to buy these bonds apart from the Central Bank of Japan. So eventually you're just printing money, and eventually you blow up the economy. So he was saying that the whole thing is on a knife edge, and he was pointing to certain measures to indicate the level of stress. One of them is the Finance Minister Index. He has an index of how many finance ministers a country goes through. And Japan, one of them committed suicide, and one of them checked into a home for the bewildered after serving as a finance minister. So there's clearly a lot of stress there.
Yes.
And on the aging population, he points out that Japan now sells more adult diapers than children's nappies. So again, you're seeing an aging population, and there simply isn't, because so many of these things are giant Ponzi schemes, there's not enough people coming in, being part of the society at the bottom to actually support the weight of this. It must go. So Japan is one of those parts of the world where economic collapse could come very quickly.
And of course, Japan has got such a high population anyway, such a high population density, they can't just bring in immigrants.
Yes, this is, and they're quite xenophobic as well as a society.
Yes. Okay, we'll move on to Russia. Another 6 months of EU sanctions, Patrick. This is the FT's report on it, and this is 21st Century Wire's coverage of it, just fresh off the production line just before we came on air.
Sure. So they've rolled over, it appears to be done, a deal, another 6 months of anti-Russian sanctions by the EU. Now this is done, our headline is a zombie-like foreign policy by the EU, and this is exactly what it is. They're sleepwalking right off an economic cliff, basically doing the bidding of Washington, NATO, desire to isolate and to marginalize Russia through, but in the process, Mike, this is hugely damaging on European traders. And leading the revolt is French businesses and politicians, and in Italy as well, for about 6 months now. So this is the last automatic rollover, and in 6 months' time, they'll actually have to vote on this. So this is going to be a problem. And I'll tell you, the last round of sanctions was initiated. A lot of people won't admit this or even talk about it. It was initiated by the downing of MH17 and not the annexation of Crimea. Okay, so there was a sort of pre-sanction regime that came down during the beginning of the Ukraine crisis, but the real sanctions came down after a false flag attack, which was the downing of MH17. So what we're going to see in October and November, another false flag or another shady incident internationally.
Perhaps it'll involve an Egyptian airliner.
Who knows, but you can see that there's no traction at all in Europe for these sanctions. And this is completely being done at the top layer of the EU and Washington and Brussels, NATO as well. So no interest at all for the Europeans. They're suffering in Spain, they're suffering in Italy, they're suffering in Greece, all over Europe. The Germans are even taking a huge hit on these sanctions just for NATO's long-range foreign policy goals. So
the obvious question that's been asked in the chat box is, does Russia care?
Russia does care. Russia would like to resume trading with Europe. Europe would like to resume trading with Russia. And so the elected leaders are against these sanctions, but the unelected super bureaucrats in Brussels are just basically doing the zombie policy, which is being dictated out of Washington and the corridors of NATO headquarters. So that's what's going on there. So not a good thing in general for the European economy that needs a kick, needs an injection right now.
For sure. Okay, David, we'll move on to Israel, and of course there was a alleged terror attack in Tel Aviv a couple of days ago. Give us a bit of the background to this and some thoughts.
Well, four fatalities we understand with a shooting attack in Tel Aviv. People dressed as Orthodox Jews. It's claimed that they are Palestinians who had infiltrated from the West Bank. That's the current information coming out of the Israeli government. There were two shooters, 4 fatalities, and many more injured. And that article there showed that one of the people who was killed was, very oddly and strangely, an academic who had written about the effect of prolonged warfare and terrorism upon Israeli society. And he was one of the victims of terrorism.
Was that an accident?
Well, it seems awfully coincidental, but there's no indication that there's anything else to it at the moment.
And as a result then, the Israelis have reverted to type. They've sealed off the West Bank and Gaza.
Everything's in lockdown, yes, so that all of the checkpoints and things will be closed, and all of the people who normally travel from the West Bank and Gaza into Israel in order to carry out their work every day will no longer be able to do so.
Right, and is this the latest attack on the Labour Party? Then this is somebody has been saying that the Jews are responsible for the slave trade.
This is an interesting article. It's in Haaretz, which is normally a very good newspaper and allows a great variety of voices to be heard. And it can be wonderfully critical of its own government to a level of courage that we very rarely see in the UK. So it's a newspaper I've got a high regard for. But this particular article, and not so much. What this is saying is, well, this person in the Labour Party said that the Jews were involved in the slave trade. That's anti-Semitism, and they've let her back in, so the Labour Party's anti-Semitic. But of course, what the person is actually doing is speaking the truth, and the truth is not anti-Semitic. The truth is just the truth. The truth of slavery is the whole world was involved in the slave trade. There are parts of Glasgow that were built on it. There's parts of Liverpool and Bristol in particular that were built on it. But the slave trade flourished in Arabia, in Africa, back into the mist of history. And I remember when we were asked as a nation to apologise for our role in the slave trade, and I thought, well, does that include ending it? Because the two biggest things that actually put the slave trade into reverse was the Methodist Church in England and the Royal Navy. But that was after years of being involved in it. So it's a complicated history. And to point out the Jewish role in that complicated history, as Tony Martin, the American academic, did, seems to be something that generates cries of anti-Semite. And it shouldn't do, because we should be able to look at the truth of history and discuss it and not be putting people in the pillory in this way. Now, Tony Martin's experience was very interesting, because he got turned on to the fact that this was a feature of the slave trade by the Nation of Islam, the American organization. But most of the research he did, he's an academic, most of the research he did and the sources he cited were in fact Jewish sources, because who else had been studying this matter? It was all Jewish academic sources. So he did a paper on this and put it into his course, and was rounded upon by the Jewish lobby, and there was a great attempt to have him hounded out of his job. Now, no one was saying he was not telling the truth. This is the point. It's not academic debate. We should have the ability to debate these things without putting them in terms of anti-Semite or anti-anything particular. It's simply the history of this planet is very complex, and we need to be able to discuss and examine that complexity and find the good and the bad where it lies, wherever that may be.
Right. Well, you've mentioned Tony Martin's book, The Jewish Onslaught, and that is, if in the slide here, that is being highlighted on Gilad Atzmon's blog. So perhaps we should just mention that last night you did a fantastic interview with Gilad Atzmon, and we hope to have that released in the next couple of days as well. So it's going to be a busy week next week. But Patrick, just to end off on this, as David's already said, of course, this wasn't just a Jewish issue, because there was the Arabic people who were involved in the slave trade as well.
Sure. If you ask any Lebanese, it's legendary, the Phoenician and the Lebanese and the Levant's role in the global slave trade. So it's not only Jewish involvement, it's Arab involvement. And the Arabs in the Levant, this might be a newsflash, but they are Semitic people as well. So if we criticize the Arabs in the Levant, does that mean we're anti-Semitic? I don't think so. I think we're just criticizing something or bringing light to something that is a part of history, and it's not meant to demonize one group or another, as David explained very well. But this issue of dividing the Labor Party, this is clearly another wedge issue. The BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel, and then the accusations that some Labor Party members are anti-Semitic. I wonder who dreamt up this public relations strategy to fragment the Labor Party. Could it be BICOM or the Conservative Friends of Israel, or one of these many lobby groups in Westminster that spends a lot of money and puts a lot of effort and who are very close to the higher echelons of the Conservative Party to basically break up and kind of wreck the Labor Party? That's what's going on right now, if you look at the headlines.
Absolutely. Right. Okay, brilliant. We're going to leave it there. Thank you very much to Patrick, to Mark Anderson. David, thank you for joining us once again, and hopefully we'll see you on Friday next week. Have a good weekend, everyone. We will be back at 1 o'clock as usual on Monday. Hopefully Brian will be back. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.